Okay, we're pretty close to being all assembled. Thank you for being on time. I appreciate that. So this is, of course, a nice day in one particular sense, and that is that you have a holiday coming up. And just in case I forget to wish you a good holiday and break, a much needed break, I understand both from you and from other students. I hope you have a great week of safe, healthy, no COVID, but good experience in the coming next week. So today we're turning to the, in a sense, we're turning to a reconsideration of the primary issue in this class. So I have a passion for this class. I've now taught it twice in, well, last semester, this semester, and I will be teaching it again next semester because we needed another seminar in the program. And it is, in a weird way, it's more like a calling for me than it is just a routine teaching assignment, because I think the issues we're dealing with are crucially important for all of us as citizens. And actually, I think they're most important for you as young people, for you as people who have your whole lives and careers and family lives and aspirations in the future. It's really important for us to kind of sort through the issues that are being presented in this course. So on the one hand, we have the traditional definition of a liberal democracy as a context in which individuals have rights, and they're secure rights, their rights and liberties of expression and association and publication of your ideas and religious freedom and the range of rights that we read about that you're, of course, very familiar with from the US Constitution and the International Declaration on Human Rights and so forth. So on the one hand, a liberal democracy is committed to the idea of equal human freedoms and liberties and rights. And then secondly, it's committed to the idea of citizen participation in policy, citizens having a voice in the actions taken by their government. And that set of institutions, and they can be separated. That's one of the things I think we've learned through many of the cases that we've examined in the past 10 weeks, 11 weeks, is that around the world, those ideas are being individually attacked, and they're being attacked as a group. Liberal democracy is under attack, but also constitutional protections of individual liberties is being attacked. And there are forces which are undermining citizens' voice in government around the world, in democracies and in pseudo-democracies and in illiberal democracies. So what I'm kind of putting in front of you is the idea that I hope that you too will have some passion for this topic, that it actually matters for you, not in a kind of a hypothetical way, not, well, this is another range of political theory that we're learning in the honors program. And yeah, it's kind of interesting, and calculus is interesting too, but rather that this is, in a sense, this is kind of existential for you and for me as well. I may not be your age, but I have grandchildren who are way younger than you. And I care about the kind of world that they will grow up in. And I care about their rights and liberties and their welfare and their economic opportunities and all of those things that you care about as young adults. Children, we need to care about their futures. And then people at the other end of the spectrum, we have concern for the next several generations. What is that saying, which people often attribute to Native Americans about preservation of the future? Anybody remember a saying about, it's said to come from Native American philosophy, about 7 generations. Is that a saying that any of you have heard before? It's an idea within environmental ethics. And the idea is that we should be paying attention not only to our immediate needs in the economy, but also the needs of future generations. And in the ethical issues having to do with the environment, if what we see in environmental change is a process of change, which by the third generation will mean that half the state of Florida will be underwater, and hurricanes are going to get worse and worse, and et cetera, all those bad things, then merely saying, well, phew, I'm glad I'm old, I'll never have to be exposed to that bad stuff, that's not a good perspective to take. A better perspective is to take a multi-generational perspective. It's why I referred to my grandchildren, but really that's only 2 generations. How many generations should we be concerned about? And the Native American philosophy that I was referring to, very lamely, since I can't tell you where it comes from, but it's the idea that in making big plans and decisions in the present, we should think about 7 generations, which would be a couple hundred years. It would be 2 centuries, really. I put it forward about environment, but I'd also like to put it in front of you about democracy, about political institutions. And in a period of rapid change, I feel quite certain, but maybe I'm completely wrong. I guess I'll have to do a little poll. We've never used the polling, and I'm going to try it now. Nobody's, okay, so here I'm adding a poll question. However you do that. Actually, forget it. That was, okay, no, here we go. Here's the question. Are you concerned about the rapid rate of climate and weather change? And I'm going to give multiple choice. How do you do this? Well, that's kind of dumb, isn't it? Answer 1, yes. Answer 2, no. And answer 3, a little bit. Okay, so there we go. We got to, okay, now, how do I make it happen? Maybe I don't know how to make it happen. Oh, launch poll, there we go. Okay, there you go. So let's just have a quick answer. Okay, I think everybody's gotten a chance to express their opinion. So if I were speaking poll talk, I would say 100% a level of concern, either a little bit of concern or a lot of concern. No one is not concerned. And why is that? Well, partly it's because you're smart people and you've paid attention to some of the science, but it's probably also because the rate of change in the past 3 or 4 years has been really dramatic. Am I right about that? Let's hear a comment. I want to bring this back to the rate of change in the perceived legitimacy of democracy. That's where I'm going with this. But let's dwell on the environment part of this just for a second. What's happened in the last couple of years that makes you even more concerned about climate change, weather change, and the implications for us and for our future generations? Ashley, what's your thinking?
Well, up in Canada, there were a lot of glaciers that were almost completely gone, which contributes heavily to not just the Canadian, environment, but also ours, because it's a sign of a much larger problem that we have within our country and world.
Okay, so ice cap melt. What comes from ice cap melt? Anybody else know anything about that? What happens when glaciers melt and the ice cap begins to melt?
Sea levels rise.
Yes, Madeline, sea levels rise. And have we seen any evidence of sea level rise in the last 3-4 years?
Definitely, yeah. Flooding and coastlines.
Exactly, right. So all along it's interesting, we hear more of it along the Atlantic coast, but also along the major rivers like the Mississippi River. But the Atlantic coast, for sure, we see it's almost routine that almost every storm brings flooding of cities and towns. So it's kind of a minor point that I'm making right now. Your perceptions, my perceptions, and lots of citizens' perceptions have shifted a bit just in the last couple of years, because what had been abstract scientific concern about global climate change is now getting reinforced by a perception from reading the newspaper, watching the news on television or social media, and seeing just incident after incident, which confirms there is a rapid process of change. It's kind of scary, and it's scary where it's going. So I think many, many citizens who were maybe not as involved in being concerned about climate change are now more concerned. Anybody see an analogy between rising concern about climate change and the topic of radical populism? What analogy do you think my slightly peculiar philosopher's brain has been thinking about for today? Do you see an analogy? Ian, you see any kind of analogy there?
I'm kind of struggling because my mind always just goes to like when we talk about populism, to like the us versus them. And in this situation, I guess we could say like all the people need to go together against like climate change, like we all need to unite, sort of thing. But I don't think that's quite where you're
going. So that's a fair comment to make. I'm kind of thinking of an analogy. We've had concern about climate change and climate science, but then we've had a lot of evidence that those concerns are realistic. Then we've, on the side of politics, on the side of the kind of theory of government, theory of democracy, there have been, probably for 20 or 25 years, there have been political scientists who have been concerned about the foundations of support for democracy. But what has changed in the past, let's even 5 years? You are all a little bit too young to be completely shocked at Brexit. Anybody have any clear memories of Brexit, the Brexit vote? Yeah, Blake, go ahead.
Yeah, I remember when it happened, and at the time I didn't quite understand the implications of it. It really, because it doesn't affect us as much, we don't hear about it as much, but it really did make a huge impact on a global scale.
Good. And then probably just 6 months later, the election of Donald Trump, which was also unexpected. The Brexit vote was expected to go the other way. All the betting, political scientists and pollsters and so forth, they all expected a victory for staying in the European Union in Great Britain. And so it was in that June of, I guess, 2016 or 15, it was a big surprise. And when I asked the question, why did the Brexit vote go as it did? But then a few months later, it was expected that Hillary Clinton, a liberal Democrat, would easily win her presidential election. And then that didn't happen. That's 2 data points. But we've also seen the rise of hate-based movements, populist movements, radical right-wing extremist movements in France, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, Spain, Greece. In the past 10 years and 15 years, we've seen this suddenly upticking graph or curve of anti-democratic movements. Now, voting against Brexit is not in itself anti-democratic. In fact, you might say it's democratic. It's expressing the will of the people. So there's one more element that we need to bring in order to make it a concern about democracy. But the analogy that I'm making with climate change is that suddenly, in a sense, the complacency which philosophers in political philosophy and maybe political scientists had, liberal democracy that's the end state. Some of our countries have gotten to that condition and others are still struggling, but liberal democracy, that's where we will stay once we get there. That it's the best system available. It is consistent with what we think about human beings. It's consistent with our moral ideas, and it will be a stable system once it gets in place. That was a sense of complacency. Even during the Cold War, for example, the Cold War was seen to be a struggle between democracy and totalitarianism. And then when the Cold War was over and the USSR collapsed, there were people. In fact, at that time, I was a visiting scholar at the Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. And it was such an interesting time to be there because there are all these international specialists who were saying, history is over, we won, and liberal democracy is the future. But what was the big surprise that happened after 1990? Well, it's the rise of right-wing, hate-based extremism. And not just in places like Afghanistan or Syria, but in places like Spain and France and the United States. So the analogy I was drawing anyway is that it seems as though today we have more reason to be anxious, more reason to be concerned. Let's call it concerned. Anxiety is bad for us, right? It's bad for our health. So maybe we don't want to be anxious, but concerned. We have more reason to be concerned about the stability and the persistence of our institutions of liberal democracy. What do you think of that as a theory? That we've seen enough incidents, enough phenomena across the world, in India, for example, we were just talking about last week, but then in many European countries, the rise of the far right, and in our country, the use of racism, xenophobia, suspicion, fear, and division as a political mobilization. We've seen enough data points to make us suddenly realize liberal democracy is not a given. It can be undermined, it can be destroyed. Does it make sense that that's a reason to be really concerned, really interested in the topics which we're considering in this course? 20 years ago, this would not have been a course, or maybe 30 years ago, because no one would have taken seriously the idea that there might be a hate-based, populist, genuinely powerful political movement that could undermine the foundations of democracy. I think 30 years ago, no political scientist would have thought that that was possible. But where are we today? Anybody here think that it's completely impossible that a hate-based, division-based, xenophobic dictator could come to power in the United States? Is that completely impossible? It's not no, okay. So I won't put up another poll. I had enough trouble with the first poll, but I'm seeing a few people shaking their heads. What does that imply for us? Well, you might say it implies, well, who cares really? I'll make out. Whatever the political system, I'll do okay. My family will do okay. I'll take steps to protect my family. That's one possibility. How do you think smart young people, it would be a good idea, or it would be smart, it would be prudent for smart young people to think about that threat. If extremist, hate-based dictatorship is a possibility, but not yet a probability, then how do you think young people might want to think about what to do? Larissa, you've always got a couple of good ideas in your head.
I think kind of looking back to the environmental justice analogy, I think that if we continue going down the same way with allowing far-right extremist groups to grow and continue to gain power and continue to threaten the ideals of democracy, then we might end up in a situation where there's a dictator, and like 30 years ago, there wasn't like a space for this class. Like, there wasn't an idea that like division and hatred could be spread within a democracy, but here we are today. So in a similar way, looking into the future, looking into future generations, and we want to create a democracy that persists even through 50, 100 years from now.
Okay, so I would summarize your point as saying the risk to the foundations of democracy is real. We don't like the result. We don't like the idea of a right-wing dictatorship. We don't like the idea of a left-wing dictatorship either. It's just that we don't have any prospect of a left-wing dictatorship. But any kind of dictatorship is the opposite of democracy. We don't want democracy. And therefore, you didn't take the therefore, and therefore we should prepare for what? Or we should engage in what kind of strategy and tactics of reinforcing democracy, helping democracy be strong and vibrant so that it is not vulnerable to the politics of division and hate. Yeah, Blake.
I think we need to really encourage political activism out into the community, as well as kind of promoting a culture of openness and understanding, trying to communicate our differences, and rather than accept just the divisions that are between us, to talk about disagreements and to kind of bring together to combat these kind of hate-based movements that thrive on paranoia, fear, etc.
So I heard 2 or 3 different ideas, and they all seem compatible. One, that we should be prepared to be activist. 2, we should communicate about our differences, but also reach across our differences. And Rawls would put that in terms of pluralism, that we should not only accept the idea that we have differences, but actually to embrace that idea, that a democracy is really built on differences of opinion and then civil debate and disagreement and struggling to bring one's own values to the public attention and maybe into law and policy. So embracing differences, advocating strongly for the views that we have, and but at the same time, the political activism part is actually crucial to the kind of theoretical topic, which we're going to spend some time on today, and that's the question of motivation. What is the motivation which leads an individual not to be merely a passive passenger on the political express? Get off at Midtown if you're going to Saks Fifth Avenue. Otherwise, if you're going to the Bronx, just stay on the train. That's a passenger just passing through. And a pilot or a co-pilot is a person who's actually in the cabin. Now, this is, my analogy is not a very good one because you can't steer a train. A train is on a set of tracks. So now I have to shift metaphors to a ship, I guess. But as democratic citizens, we want to help steer the ship. And okay, so if I look at myself, I've got a stateroom on the great ship United States, and wherever it goes, I'm going to be kind of comfy in my stateroom. That's one view. That's the passive view. The more active view is I want to be with the pilot. I want to be contributing. I don't want to grab the controls myself. I don't want to be a dictator either, but I want to have input into the decisions that we make about where we're going, which port we're heading to next. I want to contribute to, well, that's how I'm paraphrasing your comment about political activism. It is citizens expressing through their liberally defined rights, expressing their convictions, the things that they care about, and then trying to influence others as well. Other thoughts that people have about what's involved in preserving democracy and in once we take seriously the risk that democracy is not a given, and liberal democracy in particular is not a given, that it can be undermined, frankly, that it has been undermined. Tom Friedman, anybody familiar with Tom Friedman? So he's a very well-known, the world is flat, or the world is not flat, or something like that. He's a columnist for the New York Times. He writes on economic issues usually and globalization, but he has an op-ed piece, an editorial piece in the New York Times this morning that basically says American democracy had a near-death experience in the last election, 2 weeks ago, a near-death experience. That's basically his line. That is shocking to hear, not from a super radical activist, doom and gloom kind of person, but rather a mainstream editorial writer, very much respected for the New York Times, who believes that a single election hasn't eliminated the threat to a democracy, that the forces that are gathering that undermine the institutions and values of our democracy, those forces were very powerful, and we had a near miss, basically. That's what Tom Friedman says in the New York Times this morning. I think you can find that article if you wanted to pretty easily. So, okay, so I'm kind of putting forward a premise, and it's the premise for why this course is I don't know, important to really think about. Be engaged is my mantra. Be engaged in the course and be engaged in the life of being a democratic citizen. But the point that we're kind of highlighting today is we've spent 10 weeks seeing the nature of the threat, the nature of the right-wing authoritarian impulse, and the xenophobic populist, or the racist populist impulse. That's what I meant to refer to in the title of the course, the politics of division and hate. Because what do these parties have in common? What does the BJP have in common with the extreme right party in Great Britain and the Front National in France? What they have in common is that they mobilize support among their supporters on the basis of hatred and mistrust and fear of, in France, it's fear of Muslim people. In Great Britain, it's fear of anybody who wasn't born in Great Britain, of non-immigrant parents. In other words, it's very much an anti-immigrant, anti-Anglo-Saxon mobilizing. In other words, we kind of understand what the nature of the threat is, and we furthermore understand that it's not just a tiny little insect biting the elephant. Rather, it's a very serious threat. It's a threat which does have the capacity of overwhelming the institutions and values of a democracy. I saw in a newspaper recently something that I hadn't actually thought of before, that the United States is the world's oldest democracy. Is that something that you all would have said immediately? Brendan, what is that like a really familiar thought to you?
No, it's actually not what I would have guessed. It seems like, but I guess it does make sense that it seems like hasn't been around that long, but at the same time, yeah, I guess that makes sense.
So we might say, sometimes my background is not Italy, that's Italy in my background today, but sometimes it's Greece. And we might say that the Athenian polis was the oldest democracy, but of course it's not a continuous democracy and it wasn't a liberal democracy. And as I began kind of trying to find the exception, I realized Britain was not a democracy. France was not a democracy really through much of its, you're probably all getting that same public safety warning. Wear your mask, dangerous time. It's shocking, the graph. I wish I'd pulled the graph for you to see how many infections in the state we're having day after day. It just keeps going up. Okay, so we are, by that measure, world's oldest democracy, and it's worth struggling for. That's kind of what I'm putting in front of you. Or actually, I'm posing two questions. One, is it worth struggling for? And if so, why? And then secondly, there's the kind of practical question, how can we express our support for democracy? How can we express our vigilant willingness to defend the values and institutions of democracy? So that's kind of the strategy and tactics part. But I would like to have a little bit of conversation about whether it's okay just to be a passenger, a passive participant, or kind of a passenger on the great ship of democracy or political institutions in the US, or whether a higher level of involvement seems to be needed. Ricardo, you haven't spoken yet. What's your thinking?
Yeah. So my thought along that line was most people's political identity, let's say, is formed by you get your information from the news or media. I think since even the beginning of time, people got the newspaper, and that's how they created an opinion politically. But now, as we all can probably say, there's been very much a lot of corruption in the news, a lot of mistrust in what we can call the news and what we can't. And since that structure for our political identity is kind of being disformed, there's a lot of passivity in our reason for being political. So a lot of people like, I can't trust the news, which forms how I interact politically. Then I'm not going to interact because I can't interact in an honest way. So I think the one thing we do need to look at is a complete reform almost of the media and how that's presented to us. And I know some steps are being taken, and we talked about this before in a discussion post, I believe.
Yes, right.
About, filtering different social medias and things like that, and actions of that nature. But I think definitely a reform of our media and news is a step to decrease the passivity of the current generation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Yes, Colin.
I would just kind of like to say my opinion, I guess. I feel like if someone is in a position to be able to take like a passive role in a liberal democracy, they're probably in somewhat of a privileged situation to be able to say that, any change in society isn't going to affect them in a negative way enough to warrant being actively involved. So I think if someone isn't actively involved, they're doing a disservice to someone who may be under the threat of, political change that takes away some of their rights.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I think that's a really important point. I'm going to share with you a conversation I had about climate change with a conservative elected Republican official in this state. And he and I were talking a little bit carefully about the science of climate change and water rise. And he said, yeah, it seems to be true. The lakes, the Great Lakes are rising. And then I could see him thinking, he said, I have lakefront property. I should probably sell that property and move back from the lake. Any quick reaction to that thought?
First world problems.
Ricardo, you were saying?
First world problems.
Okay, but it's also not solving the problem. Ashley, were you going to make a comment?
I was just going to say he's not caring about that issue for the right reasons.
Yeah, and not caring about it for all of us. He's caring about it just in a personal way, what the property effect will be for him, but not, as a Republican, can I actually be a voice for change? Can I start demanding we stop denying climate science and take legislation that can help us? Yeah, Ian.
Like, in my opinion, it's even like worse than like just like not caring. It's he's actively now then putting someone else in a worse position to profit, because he didn't say like not like stop using it. He said he's going to sell it. So now someone else is going to lose out on all their stuff.
Right. Yeah.
That's real worrying for like an elected official.
That's a really good and interesting point. And what's interesting to me is that this man is a decent guy. I like this man. And yet we haven't talked so much about an aspect which I think is very important for politics, but it's the idea of a mental framework. So the mental framework we bring to a problem often has a lot of effect on how we analyze the problem and how we try to solve the problem. And the mental framework that my acquaintance brought to this problem was, it was kind of conservative ideology. It was, we're all in this separately. That was his ideology. Not we're all in this together, but we're all in this separately. And you've raised a major problem. I need to solve this for myself. That was kind of a mental framework, I think, that he brought to the problem. And of course, for environment, we can't solve the problem that way. We need to have more collective solutions. So let's see, where were we? We were kind of walking through, is it okay to just be a passenger, a passive participant? And Colin gave, I think, a pretty strong argument why that's not good. There are probably other considerations too, why it's not so good. If, well, this is a really extreme example, so maybe you'll think it's not a good example, but in 1936, the Republic of Spain was having problems of political stability, and General Franco was a Spanish general in Morocco, and General Franco declared a military coup from Morocco and then crossed the Mediterranean at a narrow point and began the Spanish Civil War. It's a very complicated civil war, but just to kind of simplify, if you were a Spaniard in the interior of the country where fighting was unlikely to come, how should one think about the fact that a general is trying to overthrow the elected government, the Republican government? And what role should I play in the center of Spain? Should I just ignore it and hope that it comes out well? Should I send money to the Republican cause? Should I maybe take my pots and pans and donate them to the metal drive to make weapons for the Republican forces? What kind of activism, what kind of engagement should I have in Spain in 1936, 1937, 38? You've all read a little bit of Orwell, George Orwell. Who has read any books by George Orwell? It's interesting. So this is not, Ashley, did you read that in high school?
Yeah, we read 1984 in high school.
Uh-huh. And how about you, Blake?
Yes, 1984 and Animal Farm.
Uh-huh. So I recently reread a book of his, which is called Homage to Catalonia. And it was his account of being a volunteer for the international brigades in 1936, 1937. He was English, of course, and he volunteered to go and fight in Spain in a Republican brigade in support of the Republican government against the fascists, because Franco was supported by German fascism and Italian fascism. Have you ever seen the painting Guernica? It's a Picasso painting, and it's, in fact, this is worth locating, so I'm gonna do that. Yeah, okay, it's gonna be fine. I think I'm gonna be able to share the screen with you. Here we go. Yeah, now share screen. With any good luck, I should be able to find, yeah, there we are, right there. Okay. So this is a painting by Pablo Picasso, and it's called Guernica. And it was 1937, as you see. But what's the content of the painting is that it's expressing the suffering created by a German-Italian bombing of a Spanish city. I think it was Barcelona. I'm not completely sure which city it was. The government of the Spanish Republic acquired the mural. Yeah. Okay, I'm not going to redo this. It's got a very interesting background, but what do you think of this painting? Any immediate reactions to this painting? Colin, what does it do for you?
I'm actually having a problem with my Zoom at the moment. I accidentally, like the window is so small. Just give me 1 second. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Blake, what about you?
I guess the first thing that came out stands out to me is just the like the panic and like just anguish I can see in the figures and in their facial expressions.
Mm-hmm.
See of just the, like you described, the suffering that was going on at the time.
Right, right. Very, very powerful. Very powerful. Anyway, I guess the reason I thought to put this up is that Orwell wrote a book of his own experience in Spain, fighting as a leftist, not a communist, but a leftist, fighting on behalf of the Republicans against, Republicans, by the way, means the Republican government. In other words, the democratic government of Spain, which was it was in the process of being overthrown by the General Franco, the general of the army, trying to overthrow the elected government, who was in turn being supported by German and Italian fascist military forces. And it was, I don't remember if it was German aircraft or Italian aircraft, which did this bombing of Barcelona. But it was one of the first bombings of innocent civilians in cities that occurred in either the First or the Second World War. It was before the Second World War, and it kind of was an indicator of the brutality and death that would come, 2 or 3 years later with the Second World War. But this book by Orwell it's a really fascinating book because it's more of a diary of his experience in Spain and what it meant to him and what the political kind of realities were in Spain, but also what it was like to be a militiaman in fighting in different villages in Spain. But the question I'm trying to get us to kind of think about is, what are the motivations? I'm going to close this now. What are the motivations of a democracy? Maybe it was a mistake to go down the road of Spain because that's a really extreme case. But in Great Britain or in France, maybe France is the best example, where the Front National came very close to winning the presidency a few years ago, and where the Front National would enact, or at least it has promised, it would enact policies which are anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, really kind of awful policies. The question I'm posing to you is, as French citizens, as citizens who care about égalité, fraternité, liberté, equality, brotherhood, and liberty, what kind of moral emotions, what kind of political emotions do you think would be relevant to the defense of French democracy? That's actually the key question I'm wanting you to think about. Where does the motivation to defend and to act on behalf of our political institutions and values, where does that come from? It's why I was distinguishing between the passenger on the train, who just is, I go where the train goes, I don't really have any investment in the train, versus the person who is helping to pilot the boat, and who has an investment in supporting and sustaining the arrangements of politics. Yeah, good, Colin.
I think it would come more from something like empathy towards other people and valuing like the protection of individual rights over something like patriotism.
So not so much patriotism but empathy.
Right.
And it would be empathy for people whose rights are being violated. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, or I mean, it could be in case of like like an individual's rights being violated. It could be like, I guess they're just motivation to protect like their own interests as well.
So there's a kind of self-interested motivation, which is so it's always a little hazardous for me to go on a tangent, but I'll go on one more. The Arthur Kessler. I don't think any of you have probably read Darkness at Noon, but it was a novel by Arthur Kessler in 1940 about the Moscow show trials, the trials in the Soviet Union of highly placed communist officials who were accused of treason. And they were monkey trials. They were completely phony trials with forced confessions. And then Arthur Kessler wrote this wonderful book, Darkness at Noon. There's a big story behind it. I won't go into the story, but anyway, he published the book, Darkness at Noon. Before that, though, he was Hungarian, and he was living in Berlin, and he was communist. He was a communist journalist, but communist underground. But here was the point that in his autobiography, he says, we must resist the Nazis. This was in 1933 or 34, something like that. We must resist the Nazis. First, they come for the Jews, then they come for the communists, then they come for the liberals. Have you ever heard a phrase like that? Yeah, go ahead, Ian. What do you associate with that?
I haven't heard that specific, but I've heard that sort of idea like kind of multiple times over, like throughout literature. It's just that like even if you think you're safe now, like once the first target is taken care of, like it's like power will keep on extending. Like someone who's power hungry is not going to just stop. They're going to keep going until they have everything.
Exactly. No, you explained it very well, Ian. Thank you. And that was Kessler's point. So in the book, he describes as a communist in 1934 in Berlin, fighting against Nazi black shirts. You probably know that in the rise of the Nazis, there were paramilitary groups who were called black shirts, who were violent thugs who attacked other people, attacked their enemies, and set places on fire and so forth. And the communists were actually, there's almost nothing else the communists did in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that one can have any moral admiration for. But the one thing we can maybe admire them for was in Germany, they did fight Hitler. They fought Hitler in the streets and resisted Hitler in his rise to power as dictator. But the comment which Kessler makes in his autobiography is that he was undercover, as it wasn't publicly known that he was a communist, and he was working for a liberal newspaper. And he reports that his liberal colleagues would say things like, well, those Nazis are kind of crude, but they're only attacking Jews and communists. So, it's not so serious. And Kessler's response was, first they come for the Jews, then they come for the communists, and then they come for you, which was in fact completely true. But his point was, it was kind of like Colin's point, that there's a motivation of self-interest, of kind of protecting one's own future in not permitting the corrosion of the civil rights and liberties of other people. So if gay people or homosexual people or LGBTQ people are being mistreated, even if one doesn't directly identify with the LGBTQ community, one might very well have a strong political motive that says no one's rights are safe if the rights of the LGBTQ community are not safe, or if the rights of the Muslim community are not safe, or the Jewish community are not safe, or possibly the Catholic community. Was there ever a period in US history when Catholics were not safe on the street? You know anything about that? Yeah, Blake, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I think there was a point in time when, unfortunately, Catholics were very much stigmatized and um, and targeted and excluded from the main part of society.
Yeah, kind of stigmatized and excluded. And I don't know if you know this or not, but the Ku Klux Klan is most known for its anti-Black actions and violence, but it was also anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic. So the Ku Klux Klan was, fundamentally anti-democratic, anti-liberal. And I guess the point I'm getting at is, here is one reason to be a loyal Democrat. Should I give you a definition of what I mean by a loyal Democrat? A person who is committed to the importance and the worthiness of the liberal institutions of constitutional protections of rights and majoritarian politics. And then to be a loyal Democrat is to be a person who not only signs the pledge that says, yes, I believe in democracy, but who also takes specific action. Though we haven't yet talked about what specific action it might be. I've given you ridiculously dramatic examples, like from Orwell and Kessler, but those aren't the options that we should be thinking about. We don't need to worry about armed conflict in the streets, but what are the steps we can take in the next 5 years and 10 years to make sure that our democracy gets stronger, not weaker? That is actually the concern that Tom Friedman has in his editorial today, that anybody who thinks the election's behind us, Joe Biden won the election, thank goodness the threat to democracy is over, that's foolish, that the forces which were undermining of democratic institutions and values prior to November 4th, those forces are still out there. The individual has not been reelected to office, but the anti-democratic forces which supported him are still in place. They're still present, and therefore we have the question, what steps, what actions can people who care for democratic institutions, what steps can we take to secure our institutions for everyone? And I think what we've been dwelling on for the last couple of minutes is an important point. It's a point, Colin, I think it was you who said empathy, used the word empathy. A different word would be a civic regard for all groups in our society, and a concern that no group should lose its rights, should be mistreated, should lose constitutional rights or legal rights. We shouldn't imagine, the right wing will disallow votes from the city of Detroit, and that's anti-democratic, but thank goodness it's only the city of Detroit. Why am I thinking about the city of Detroit? Do you happen to know that there was a newsworthy item yesterday? How many of you live in Wayne County? I live in Washington now, but maybe half of you live in Wayne County. So there was a very dramatic moment that made national news yesterday, because there were, let's see, I'm gonna tell this to stop. There were ballots were to be certified yesterday by whatever the board of electors is in Wayne County. And there are 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. In all past elections, including in March, there was unanimous routine certification of the election. Yesterday, the votes from Wayne County, lots and lots of voters, lots and lots of votes were not certified, because 2 Republican electors voted against certification and 2 Democrat electors voted in favor of certification. What's the result of that? Brenda, did you say you live in Wayne County? Who does? Who's a Wayne County voter? Okay, Ashley, Blake, and Ezra, your votes would not have counted, or at least would not have counted until the next level of certification. And in the state of Michigan, how should we feel about that? Well, we should feel outraged that people's votes are being denied. They're being invalidated For what reason? Well, it was very clear from what was said, including by a person who's a Dearborn alum, I'm very sorry to say, a person that I had very good relationships with after she went into the State House. But her statements were all political. They weren't about the legitimacy of the vote. They were political statements about the president. If we were to say, well, that's a minor deviation, but most of our democracy is intact, that would be a big mistake, wouldn't it? Or it seems to me it would be a big mistake, because it would be an undermining, small undermining, but an undermining of the most basic democratic rights that we have, the right to vote and the right for our vote to be counted. Fortunately, what's really interesting is that later in the day, those two, whatever they're called, officials reversed their vote, and the Wayne County votes were validated, were authenticated. So thank heavens, your votes count. That's good. Yeah, go ahead, Blake. Yeah. Blake.
Only on the condition that there's an audit of the of Wayne County, or of the votes that aren't clear. So there's still that level of distrust in the results of the election.
Right. And that's a fairly small number of votes, I think, though, right? Yeah. So what am I getting at here? What I'm kind of asking us to think about, what are the threats of erosion of democratic institutions and democratic values? And unfortunately, it seems to me, I hope I don't sound like I'm preaching or something, but it just seems to me, as an observer, we have a lot of evidence over the past 2 weeks of a willingness on the part of some politicians to overlook democratic values in favor of political interests, kind of short-term political interests. And that's really, really worrisome. If we're just passengers on the train, then I suppose we could just say, well, that's weird. They were throwing a bunch of stuff out the window, but nothing to me. Or we can take the view, I'm a voter of Michigan, and even though I don't live in Wayne County, I care about the fact that Blake lives in Wayne County and Ashley lives in Wayne County, and your votes need to be counted. And all of us in Michigan have an interest in counting all the votes, whichever way they go. In other words, support for the institutions of vote counting is not support for one party versus another party. It's support for the institutions and the institutional arrangements of electoral process. So I introduced a phrase to you. I know I've used it before. In fact, we had a little discussion about whether it's the right phrase. Civic loyalty, I think, was the phrase that I introduced. It was the idea that there is somehow a moral emotion that corresponds to one's attachment to the institutional arrangements of democracy. There is a kind of a moral political motivation which goes along with our endorsement of the institutions of liberal democracy. I think I've asked you before, I'm pretty sure I have, but is that a good phrase, civic loyalty? Or can you think of a better phrase? I think one of you, maybe Colin, you said you thought patriotism was not the right word to use. Patriotism is also an emotion word, right? To be patriotic is to feel something about one's country. And nationalism, I suppose, is also racism is, there's certainly an emotional underpinning of racism. So myself, I'm willing to use the word patriotism, civic patriotism I would use, but loyalty is another word. But here's the question for you. What is the kind of package of emotions which are associated with active support for the institutions of a democracy? Can you think of a better phrase, or do you like that phrase, civic loyalty? Yeah, Ian.
So at first, I really didn't like the phrase of loyalty because in my head that instantly goes to like you have to stick with something like even when it's like wrong because like you are loyal, you have to do as it says. But then I don't know if the civic part fixes that part, but I think if it's loyalty to like the specific ideals of everyone is equal, like as long as it's not to a specific institution or a specific government, like if it's more like general, that it becomes safer. So I don't know if that's encompassed by the civic part, but that's my.
I think that's a really good point, Ian. Let's take a concrete example. We might think that a part of our liberal democracy, the institutional realization of our liberal democracy, is the Electoral College. And we might think the Electoral College itself is unjust. It's unjust because it counts people's votes, or it weights people's votes differently. People from low population states are overestimated in selecting the president. So we might say, as a matter of political judgment, political philosophy judgment, we think the Electoral College itself is not a good part of liberal democracy. And so taking Ian's point, I am civically loyal to the institutions of liberal democracy. However, I'm also a loyal critic of the idea or the institutional reality of the Electoral College. Is it possible to take that view, or is that inconsistent? That's really the question Ian is asking. Does loyalty involve not being a critic at all? Josh, I can see you thinking it over.
Yeah, so I honestly think it could go both ways a little bit. You can still be critical of someone and keep your loyalty, but it's kind of a hard topic because then you can make the argument that if you are critical, then your loyalty is questionable, and therefore, you may not be considered loyal at that point. So I guess it is an argument and depends on what your personal opinion of what you consider to be a definition of loyal. And yeah.
Okay, so it's you're right. There's a complexity here. When government takes actions which are controversial, of course, to say it's controversial is to say that many people, a number of people do not agree with those actions. So to be a loyal supporter of our system of government might be thought to mean that every action taken by our government we must loyally support. So if I were trying to write a dictionary entry for the idea of loyalty, I would want to make the substantive statement that loyalty is compatible with being critical of some aspects of the thing that we are loyal to. So if I'm a loyal friend to Adam, and I also think Adam is a little dismissive of, I don't know, people who come from Ohio. So he needs to improve his attitudes a little bit towards Ohioans. So I'm loyally critical of Adam, but I'm loyal to Adam. I support Adam. I believe in the goodness of Adam, something like that. Here's a more practical example. There is the question of criticism of the state of Israel, actions of the state of Israel. And Israel, over the past 15 years or so, has taken many actions which many Americans are very critical of when it comes to the land rights of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. So there's land rights in East Jerusalem, and the state of Israel has put those rights into doubt in many different ways. And then there's the settler policies. So there are specific policies that have been undertaken by the state of Israel. And it is sometimes said that American Jews, if they support the state of Israel, they must support those actions as well. And I guess what you would call the liberal Jewish community response is to say, we are completely loyal to the state of Israel, but we absolutely reserve our right to criticize specific governmental policies. And that criticizing the governmental policies is not disloyalty. Frankly, it's the opposite. We're looking to make this government better, and so no contradiction between being loyal to Adam, but asking him to change his attitudes towards people in Ohio, or being loyal to the state of Israel, but asking it to change its policies towards the Palestinians. So if I were writing my entry, my Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on loyalty, I would introduce that complication. I don't know how to qualify it, but okay, so let's say that that's what I'm imagining when I say that the emotion for democracy, the emotion in support of democracy, is civic loyalty with the asterisk. Any particular set of institutions is imperfect, and it's not a contradiction to one's civic loyalty to be critical of those, what I perceive to be imperfections. I suppose we could ask, well, how about the person who's civically loyal, but who thinks all of the institutions are wrong? I guess that's a little bit more of a difficult case. What do you think about, well, let me take a step back. We spent a little bit of time 8 or 10 weeks ago working on Rawls's theory of political psychology. And remember, it was the idea that Rawls had the belief that if you lived in a just society, you would acquire the emotions needed to make that society stable. So if you live in a just society, you will have some emotion. It's really the emotion I'm calling civic loyalty, to be supportive of its institutions and to help it endure when, challenges come along. So Rawls believes that the conditions of living in a just society lead also to emotions of support. And I think we sort of came to kind of a conclusion that, well, number one, there doesn't seem to be any empirical evidence that it's true that people living in an approximately just society come to be supportive. But then secondly, even if it were true, it's not clear that that particular emotion is strong enough to generate the strands of cohesion that would be needed. So maybe that's the next term that ought to be introduced, because we're going to be talking about it after the Thanksgiving break. The idea of social or political cohesion. Anybody want to take a stab at? I gave you my best shot at what is civic loyalty. Would anybody like to say what is involved in the idea of political cohesion? Josh, your screen just flickered.
So sure. So political cohesion. So being cohesive means sort of not necessarily bringing everyone together, but more so working together fluidly and I guess effectively. So political cohesion in that sense would be sort of taking the ideal of pluralism in our case and bringing those together and having those being effectively working together for the benefit of a liberal democracy. Excellent.
That's such a good explanation, much better than I would have managed, because you're bringing together both the idea that a liberal democracy has sources of difference. So to be cohesive is not to say we're all the same, we all have the same beliefs, but it's to say that there is some bond that allows us to connect across those differences in support of something else. And that something else is the value and the stability of our political institutions. So we might say political cohesion is a sociological reality, if it is a reality at all. It may be that we don't have cohesion in our country any longer, or we have two populations, each of which has cohesion, but there's no cohesion across those populations. That's possible. But what we might say ideally, maybe in Sweden, that people disagree about a lot of different things in Sweden, but they have things that they agree about. What does Rawls call that? He calls that overlapping consensus. But what we're kind of adding to when we talk about cohesion, we're basically saying when there is an overlapping consensus about values, that also creates a kind of ability to hang together, to work together, to be willing to partner in support of this action or that action. I wonder, did any of you by any chance, well, I won't ask you because it's kind of putting you on the spot, but in my Ann Arbor class, one student, master's class, said, I'm going to be busy on election day because I'm serving as an election volunteer in Detroit. I thought that was pretty cool. And it turned out this young man had grown up in Ann Arbor, and he's done this for about 10 years. He did it, he started in high school, and he serves as an election volunteer in Detroit every year. And why does he do that? Well, I think he does it because early on, he kind of developed civic loyalty. He developed the idea that voting and elections are really important. He also, I think, if I understood him correctly, developed the idea Ann Arbor should not be a bubble. We shouldn't think of our little city as being, you know, the beginning and the end of politics. And in the state of Michigan, we're all in a large and diverse and pluralistic state. And I'd like to have some political involvement that's outside my home city. What does that express in terms of activity and action? It expresses some values that I think many of us would share. The importance of, you know, in a practical way, the importance of voting mechanisms, the importance of pluralism and diversity in our state, the importance of making sure that every person's vote counts. These are things that it's not that hard to generate a lot of agreement about, and maybe that would fall into our overlapping consensus, whether we are progressive Democrats or conservative Republicans or possibly progressive Republicans. Okay, well, we didn't make quite as much progress on this. I was hoping to solve this problem. What does liberal democracy require in times of stress? But it's okay. We still have 2 weeks to solve the problem because it's an important problem and we'll make more progress. So I wish you a happy Thanksgiving, and I look forward to coming back together in 2 weeks. Be well and be safe. Take real good care of yourselves. Bye-bye.